The phone call came at 2 a.m. "Frank, we need you at the base immediately." The 68-year-old mechanic grabbed his tools and drove toward Fort Campbell, not knowing that his simple act of fixing a young soldier's car had just saved a life. Frank Murphy has been waking up at 5:30 a.m. for the past 40 years, not because anyone forces him to, but because machines don't fix themselves and soldiers don't have time to wait. His small auto repair shop sits on the edge of Clarksville, Tennessee, just 15 miles from Fort Campbell Army Base. The faded sign outside reads "Murphy's Auto Repair, Earn Honest Work, Fair Prices," in letters that have been touched up so many times they tell their own story of persistence. The shop itself looks like something from another era. Oil-stained concrete floors, fluorescent lights that flicker when the weather changes, and the constant smell of motor oil mixed with old coffee. Frank's office is barely larger than a closet, containing a metal desk covered in repair orders and a wall calendar from 2019 that no one bothered to replace. But the most telling detail in Frank's shop isn't visible to casual customers. Behind his desk, partially hidden by automotive manuals, sits a wooden box containing something Frank hasn't spoken about in over 30 years. Inside that box, wrapped in a faded American flag, lies a bronze star with valor, 2 purple hearts, and a combat infantryman badge from his service in Vietnam. Frank never displays them, never mentions them, and most people who know him have no idea they exist. At 68, Frank moves with the deliberate pace of a man whose body carries decades of physical labor. His hands are permanently stained with grease, his back curved from years of bending over engines, and his eyes hold the kind of patience that comes from understanding that some things can't be rushed. He lives alone in a modest house 2 blocks from his shop, a simple life built around routine, service, and a quiet dedication to helping others that few people recognize. The soldiers from Fort Campbell started coming to Frank's shop about 15 years ago, drawn initially by his competitive prices and proximity to the base. What kept them coming back was something entirely different. Frank had a way of treating every service member who walked through his door with a respect that went beyond customer service. He never asked unnecessary questions, never judged the condition of their vehicles, and somehow always found a way to keep their repair costs within a young soldier's budget. Private First Class Marcus Coleman discovered Frank's shop on a Tuesday afternoon in March, when his 2008 Honda Civic broke down on Highway 41A. The engine had been making strange noises for weeks, but Marcus, like most junior enlisted soldiers, had been putting off the repair because he couldn't afford it. When the car finally died completely, leaving him stranded on the side of the road, Marcus called the first tow truck he found. Frank was alone in the shop when Marcus arrived. The young soldier climbed out of his disabled car looking exactly like what he was, a 19-year-old kid far from home, wearing a wrinkled Army PT uniform, and carrying the weight of financial stress that comes with military pay grades barely above minimum wage. "What seems to be the problem?" Frank asked, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better decades. Marcus explained the symptoms, the strange noises, the loss of power, the final breakdown. Frank listened without interruption, then popped the hood and spent several minutes examining the engine with the focused attention of a surgeon reviewing X-rays. "Timing belt," Frank said finally, "snapped clean through. You're lucky it didn't destroy the whole engine." Marcus felt his stomach drop. He knew enough about cars to understand that timing belt replacement was expensive, the kind of repair that could easily cost more than the car was worth. "How much are we talking about?" Frank studied the young soldier's face, reading the anxiety there like a familiar book. He'd seen that expression hundreds of times over the years, on faces that belonged to kids barely out of high school, serving their country while struggling to pay for basic necessities. "Tell you what," Frank said, "let me order the parts and we'll figure out the details later. Right now you need to get back to base." 3 days later, Marcus returned to find his Honda running better than it had in months. Frank handed him the keys along with a receipt that showed a parts cost of $180 and labor charges of exactly $0. "Sir, there's got to be a mistake," Marcus said, staring at the paper. "Labor charges? No mistake," Frank interrupted. "Consider it a welcome to Tennessee discount." What Marcus didn't know was that Frank had paid for the timing belt parts out of his own pocket and absorbed the labor cost because he recognized something familiar in Marcus's situation. 35 years earlier, Frank had been a young soldier struggling to make ends meet, and he remembered the people who had helped him when he needed it most. Word about Frank's generosity spread through Fort Campbell, the way news travels in military communities, quickly and with growing embellishment. Soldiers started coming to Murphy's auto repair, not just because Frank was skilled and affordable, but because they knew he understood their situation in ways that civilian mechanics didn't. Sergeant First Class David Rodriguez brought his truck to Frank after a fender bender that his insurance wouldn't fully cover. Frank repaired the damage for the cost of materials and threw in a complete brake job that the truck desperately needed. When Rodriguez tried to pay for the additional work, Frank simply said, "Brakes are a safety issue. Can't have you driving around on bad brakes." Specialist Jennifer Hayes came to Frank when her car's transmission started failing 2 weeks before she was scheduled to deploy. Frank worked overtime to rebuild the transmission, finished the job in 3 days instead of the usual week, and charged only for parts. When Jennifer asked why, Frank replied, "Can't have your family worrying about you and your car troubles while you're deployed." These weren't isolated incidents. Over 15 years, Frank had provided thousands of dollars in free labor, donated countless hours of overtime work, and absorbed repair costs that should have put him out of business. He never advertised his generosity, never sought recognition, and always deflected gratitude with the same quiet humility that defined everything else about his life. What the soldiers didn't know was that Frank's generosity went far beyond automotive repair. He kept a mental catalogue of every service member who came through his shop, remembering their names, their units, their families, and their struggles. When soldiers deployed, Frank often received postcards from overseas, brief messages from young men and women who wanted to stay connected to someone who had shown them unexpected kindness. Frank's shop became more than a repair facility. It became a sanctuary for soldiers who needed more than mechanical fixes. Young service members would stop by just to talk, to seek advice about everything from military careers to personal relationships. Frank listened with the patience of someone who understood that sometimes people needed to be heard more than they needed to be helped. The phone call that would change everything came on a cold Tuesday night in November. Frank was at home, settling into his recliner with a cup of coffee and the day's newspaper, when his landline rang at exactly 2:17 a.m. "Mr. Murphy, this is Colonel Sarah Mitchell from Fort Campbell. I'm sorry to call so late, but we have an urgent situation and we need your help." Frank sat up immediately. In 15 years of serving soldiers, he'd never received a call from a colonel, especially not in the middle of the night. "What's the problem, Colonel?" "It's about Private First Class Marcus Coleman. Do you remember him?" Frank remembered Marcus clearly, the nervous 19-year-old with the broken timing belt who had been one of the first soldiers Frank had helped years ago. "Of course. What's happened?" "Marcus is in our emergency psychiatric facility. He's been struggling with severe depression, and tonight he tried to hurt himself. We've stabilized him physically, but he's refusing to speak to anyone. The only thing he's said in the past 4 hours is that he wants to talk to Frank Murphy, the mechanic who fixed his car." Frank felt his chest tighten. He'd known Marcus for years now, had watched him grow from a scared teenager into a competent soldier. Marcus had been deployed twice, had been promoted to sergeant, and had always seemed to be thriving in military life. "What do you need me to do? Would you be willing to come to the base? Our psychiatrist thinks that talking to someone Marcus trusts might help us reach him." "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Frank interrupted, already reaching for his keys. Frank drove toward Fort Campbell, with his mind racing through every interaction he'd had with Marcus over the past several years. At the base gate, Frank was met by Colonel Mitchell herself, a composed woman in her 40s who greeted him with the kind of gratitude usually reserved for emergency responders. "Mr. Murphy, thank you for coming. Marcus is in a secure facility, and he's not in good shape emotionally. Our goal is simply to get him talking to someone." Frank nodded, following the colonel through a series of corridors that led to the base medical facility. They stopped outside a room with a small window, and Frank could see Marcus sitting on a narrow bed, staring at the floor with an expression of complete defeat. Frank entered the room slowly, pulling a chair close to Marcus's bed and sitting down without saying anything. For several minutes, they sat in silence, Frank waiting patiently while Marcus continued staring at the floor. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you help me, Frank? That first day, with the timing belt, you didn't know me. I was nobody. Frank considered his answer carefully. In all his years of helping soldiers, no one had ever asked him that question directly. You weren't nobody, Frank said quietly. You were a young man serving his country, far from home, dealing with problems that felt bigger than you could handle. I've been there. Marcus looked up for the first time, his eyes red from crying. But you kept helping. All these years. Free repairs, staying late, never asking for anything. I never understood why. Frank stood up and walked to the small window overlooking the base. Marcus, do you know what I did before I became a mechanic? Marcus shook his head. I was a soldier. Vietnam, 1971 to 1973. I was 19 when I got there, just like you were when you first came to my shop. I was scared, broke, and a long way from anything that felt like home. Marcus was listening now, his attention fully focused on Frank for the first time all night. I remember this old mechanic in Saigon. Frank continued. Guy named Chen, who ran a little repair shop near our base. American soldiers would bring their jeeps and trucks to him, and he would fix them for almost nothing. Never asked questions, never made us feel like charity cases, just did good work for people who needed help. Frank turned back to face Marcus. One day I asked Chen the same question you just asked me. You know what he said? Marcus waited. He said, everyone needs someone to believe they're worth fixing. That stuck with me for 50 years. The silence that followed was different from the earlier quiet. This was the silence of understanding, of connection being made across decades and circumstances. I came back from Vietnam angry, Frank said, sitting back down. Angry at the war, angry at the people who protested against us, angry at a country that seemed to want to forget we existed. I was working construction, drinking too much, getting into fights. I was self-destructing just like you were tonight. Marcus's eyes widened slightly. He'd never imagined Frank as anything other than the calm, steady presence he'd always known. What changed? Marcus asked. Chen's words kept echoing in my head. Everyone needs someone to believe they're worth fixing. I realized that I was waiting for someone else to fix me, but maybe what I needed was to become the person who fixes others. Frank reached into his pocket and pulled out something Marcus had never seen before, a small worn photograph of a young soldier in Vietnam-era fatigues, barely recognizable as a much younger Frank Murphy. I opened my shop in 1985 with money I saved working construction. For the first 10 years, I was just trying to make a living. But when soldiers from Fort Campbell started coming in, I remembered what it felt like to be young and struggling, and far from home. I remembered Chen. Marcus studied the photograph, seeing Frank in an entirely new light. So every time I helped a young soldier with a car repair, Frank continued, I was honoring Chen's memory, and trying to be for others what he was for me. It was never about the cars, Marcus. It was about believing that every person who walked through my door was worth fixing, worth helping, worth saving. For the first time in hours, Marcus smiled slightly. I never knew. You weren't supposed to know. The help only works if it doesn't feel like charity. Colonel Mitchell, who had been watching through the window, entered the room quietly. Marcus, are you ready to talk to Dr. Williams now? Marcus looked at Frank, then nodded slowly. Yeah, I think I am. As Frank prepared to leave, Marcus stood up and extended his hand. Frank, I need you to know that what you did for me, all of it, not just the car repairs, it probably saved my life long before tonight. Frank shook the young soldier's hand firmly. That's what Chen would have wanted. 3 months later, Frank received an invitation to a ceremony at Fort Campbell. Marcus Coleman was being recognized for his volunteer work with a military suicide prevention program, using his own experience to help other soldiers who were struggling with similar challenges. At the ceremony, Frank sat in the audience watching as Marcus spoke to a room full of service members about the importance of seeking help and finding mentors. During his speech, Marcus looked directly at Frank and said, sometimes the person who saves your life isn't wearing a uniform. Sometimes they're wearing greasy coveralls and carrying a wrench. After the ceremony, Colonel Mitchell approached Frank. Mr. Murphy, I want you to know that what you did for Marcus started something bigger. He's convinced 3 other soldiers to seek help when they were having thoughts of self-harm. Your repair shop may have prevented more casualties than some military operations. Frank felt embarrassed by the attention, as he always did. I just fix cars, Colonel. No, sir. Colonel Mitchell replied firmly, "You fix people. The cars are just your excuse to get close enough to help." 6 months after that night at the base, Frank's routine hadn't changed much. He still woke up at 5:30 a.m., still opened his shop at 7 o'clock, still treated every customer with the same patient respect he'd always shown. But word of his emergency call to help Marcus had spread through Fort Campbell, and something subtle had shifted in how soldiers approached his shop. Young service members started coming to Frank, not just for automotive repairs, but for advice, for conversation, for the kind of mentorship that the military couldn't provide through official channels. Frank's shop became an unofficial counseling center where soldiers could talk about their problems without fear of judgment or military consequences. When Brigadier General Robert Hayes heard about the mechanic who was helping soldiers with more than just automotive problems, he decided to investigate personally. General Hayes arrived at Frank's shop on a Thursday afternoon, driving an unmarked civilian vehicle and wearing casual clothes. Frank spent an hour diagnosing a simple belt replacement, while General Hayes observed the interactions between Frank and the soldiers who came and went from the shop. He watched Frank patiently explain automotive basics to a young soldier. He observed Frank quietly absorb the cost of extra labor when a private couldn't afford the full repair bill. He noticed the way soldiers' faces lit up when they saw Frank. When Frank finished the repair and handed General Hayes a bill for exactly the cost of the replacement belt with no labor charges, the general revealed his identity. "Mr. Murphy, I'm Brigadier General Robert Hayes, commanding officer at Fort Campbell. I came here because I've been hearing stories about you, and I wanted to see for myself what you're doing for our soldiers." Frank immediately straightened, showing the automatic respect for military authority that never fully leaves a veteran. "General, sir, I hope I haven't overstepped any boundaries." "On the contrary," General Hayes replied, "you've been filling a gap in our support system that we didn't even know existed. Our soldiers trust you in ways they sometimes can't trust their own command structure." General Hayes paused, studying Frank's modest shop with new appreciation. "Mr. Murphy, what you're doing here is exactly what the military should be doing, but often can't because of bureaucracy and regulations. You're treating our soldiers like family. They remind me of myself when I was their age," Frank said simply. "I'd like to propose something," General Hayes continued. "What if we made your relationship with Fort Campbell official? We want to establish a partnership between your shop and Fort Campbell. You'd become an official family readiness support resource, which would allow us to refer soldiers to you not just for automotive needs, but for mentorship and guidance." Frank shook his head immediately. "General, I appreciate the offer, but I don't want money for helping people. That defeats the purpose. What if the funding went toward expanding your ability to help? Better equipment, additional training resources, maybe even hiring another mechanic so you can spend more time mentoring." Frank considered this proposal carefully. "Would I still be able to help soldiers the same way I always have? No paperwork, no reporting requirements, no military oversight of my conversations with them?" "Absolutely. The only thing that would change is that we'd formally recognize what you're already doing and give you resources to do it better." Frank agreed to the partnership, and 6 months later, Murphy's Auto Repair had expanded into a larger facility with state-of-the-art equipment and 2 additional mechanics. Frank used the extra capacity not to increase his profits, but to help more soldiers more effectively. The new arrangement allowed Frank to offer automotive maintenance classes where soldiers could learn to perform basic repairs on their own vehicles. These classes became forums for broader discussions about life skills, financial management, and career planning. 2 years after his crisis intervention with Marcus Coleman, Frank received a letter that would become one of his most treasured possessions. It was from Chen Nakamura, the grandson of the mechanic who had helped Frank in Vietnam 50 years earlier. "Mr. Murphy," the letter read, "my grandfather passed away last year at the age of 94. Before he died, he told me stories about the American soldiers he helped during the war, and he specifically mentioned a young man named Frank, who asked him why he was so generous with his repairs. My grandfather never forgot that conversation, and he spent the rest of his life wondering what happened to that young soldier. When I saw an article about your work with Fort Campbell, I recognized the story my grandfather had told me dozens of times. He would be so proud to know that his words lived on in your actions. Frank read that letter 3 times before the full significance hit him. Chen had been impacted by their conversation just as much as Frank had been. The kindness had traveled in both directions, creating a chain of compassion that had spanned 5 decades and 2 generations. At age 70, Frank finally understood that his life's work hadn't been about fixing cars or even about helping individual soldiers. It had been about perpetuating a cycle of kindness that began with an old mechanic in Saigon and would continue long after Frank himself was gone. Today, Murphy's Auto Repair continues to serve the Fort Campbell community with the same philosophy Frank established 40 years ago. The shop now employs 6 mechanics, including 3 veterans who learned their trade from Frank and share his commitment to serving others. Marcus Coleman, now a staff sergeant, stops by the shop regularly, not for automotive service, but to help Frank mentor younger soldiers. Marcus has become living proof that people can overcome their darkest moments and go on to help others facing similar struggles. The wooden box containing Frank's military decorations still sits behind his desk, still largely hidden from view. Frank never did display those medals publicly, but he no longer hides his military service from the soldiers he helps. On the wall of Frank's office hangs a new addition, a photograph of Chen Nakamura from 1972, standing beside his repair shop in Saigon. Below the photograph is a small plaque with Chen's words, "Everyone needs someone to believe they're worth fixing." Frank Murphy understood that true service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. Sometimes it begins when you pick up a wrench and decide that every person who walks through your door deserves to be treated like family. Because some battles are fought with weapons, but others are won with kindness, patience, and the unwavering belief that every person is worth saving. And sometimes, the most important repairs happen not under the hood of a car, but in the hearts of people who just need someone to believe they matter. If you enjoyed this story, click the like button and subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow I have another story especially for you.